one of the things about building a company is that you really need to manage it up into the right steadily over time. And I think people fool themselves that if they get an outsized valuation that it has proven anything. But when you get an outsized valuation on a B or a C or a D round, who wins? The employees don't win because they didn't monetize that. Your investors don't win. Actually, they've taken a ton of risk. You don't win as a CEO, I can tell you that, because that monkey is now on your back. You're going to have to grow into that number. And as you think toward a successful exit of some sort, how are you going to get all those people paid?
All right, welcome to OK Computer. I'm Dan Nathan. I am joined by Mike Palmer. He is the CEO of Sigma Computing. We're going to get all up into what Sigma does, but I want to go through a whole host of things. We're going to talk a little bit about the macro as it relates to tech, how we met. We kind of met but didn't meet a couple weeks ago at RBC's TMT conference at a dinner with a bunch of other private tech CEOs, a bunch of bankers, the CEO of RBC Capital, which was really interesting to hear his take on a whole host of things, how actually they use technology and how they're thinking about banking and how they think about the landscape going forward. So we're going to hit a bunch of that. I want to start with thank you for being here.
It is an absolute pleasure.
Thanks. And so you and I met, but we didn't meet, as I just said. We were at this dinner. It was a long table. There was probably about 10 or so tech CEOs. There was probably a half a dozen bankers from RBC, and it was the CEO, like I said, and you were all the way at the other end. I couldn't really see you, but it was a discussion for about 2 hours, and it was, to me, very fascinating. You kind of stole the show. I got out of there, and I said to Jesse Chassie, who runs Tech ECM at RBC, I said, I'd like to talk to Mike with the mics on. So that's what we're doing here. So thanks again for being here. Before we get into Sigma, before we get into the macro, before we kind of hear a little bit about how you're working with partners, your growth trajectory, valuations and the like, I want to take a step back. As you and I just talked for 2 minutes, we happen to hail from the same town, which is pretty fascinating. So we just went through a whole bunch of stuff. We both, and I hope I'm not just kind of doing something you want to do. We graduated high school in 1991 across town in Syracuse. We both played lacrosse. We just realized that we probably played each other for 6 years starting in 7th grade, right?
We had to have.
Right? So Liverpool, Fayetteville Manlius, super cool stuff. You went on to University of Rochester. I want to hear this. When you got out of there, you went to work for Teach for America.
I did.
And so I heard my sisters were at Syracuse. They graduated in 1992. The keynote speaker was Wendy Kopp. And I remember it, who was the founder of Teach for America, and I was like fascinated a little bit about the organization. I'd heard of like the Peace Corps and stuff like that. It was kind of like the Peace Corps for education. Talk a little bit about how you went from U of R, your major there, you weren't not like computer science or anything like that, and how you got to Teach for America.
Great question. I wish there was a fancier story than I have no idea what the hell to do with my life.
Right.
And I was, in fact, I was 5 years at U of R. That's how little I knew what to do. I had a 4-year. I could have graduated. They had a really neat program called Take 5, where they give you a free 5th year. I took advantage of that, still trying to figure it out.
So you did a master's?
I did not. I did a second degree, an undergraduate
cool.
You get to put together like your own kind of program.
Yeah.
So, I guess I got to learn more. Having said that, none of it was very practical, to be honest with you. And Teach for America both seemed like a good cause, but I think probably more importantly than anything else was we're both, as you said, from Syracuse. For those of you out there that have never been to Syracuse, my guess is you'll never go there either. There's not a lot going on in Syracuse. I had very little perspective on the world.
Is your family still there?
No, everyone has moved. Okay. Well, yeah, everyone has moved. And, Syracuse, actually, I'll tell you a little stat about Syracuse, Buffalo, and Rochester. It's the one place in the U.S. that have had consistently declining population over a long period of time, and it's really hard to grow GDP under those circumstances. So it's not economically the place where you can, I guess, realize your ambitions. And so I joined Teach for America and got moved to California. And that was really how everything began for me. I always tell everybody about Teach for America, the thing that you learn teaching is how to entertain an audience. You can imagine, I taught ESL physics. So can you imagine?
Did you know anything about ESL physics by then or no?
I knew physics.
Oh, physics, okay.
And I thought, wrongfully, this is great. My grandmother is Cuban, and I was like, this is great. Mexican kids will speak Spanish, will be no problem. 80% of the kids in my class were Vietnamese.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, this is what I was not prepared for. Yeah. So you can imagine it's like, I don't know, the 7th or 8th class of the day, you're learning physics and you speak very little English. How little attention that you want to pay in that class at that time. So as a teacher, you were figuring out, how am I going to get this point across to these kids? And they're kids from very diverse backgrounds. And I did that for 2 years. And I will tell you that its relevance in terms of business is extraordinary. Being able to be in front of an audience, being able to make your point clear and understood is a really hard skill to learn. And you definitely learn it on the
very
battlefield
early
there.
age. A lot of folks, when you think about, like you're nearly 3 decades out, right, from college, and you think about like that experience early on, and then you think about how you have to go in front of lots of different stakeholders, right? Whether it be your employees, the folks that you're trying to win business from, obviously investors and the like. You do speaking at like conferences like we just talked about. A lot of folks really get nervous about that stuff. They're really good at certain things, and like that's the one thing that like really terrorizes them, right? And so you learn that at a very early age, how to do that.
You definitely get over it quickly.
Yeah.
And funny thing is, actually, just even bridging a little further, when I left Teach for America, I had a brief stint at Anderson Consulting, but that was the time when you remember the .com era started to really take off. And talk about learning things before you were sort of ready from an experience point of view. At that time in San Francisco, there just weren't enough people to kind of fuel the jobs that were being created. So if you had any experience doing anything at all, you were immediately a leader. But you really had no skills.
Have you been at San Francisco since then, the whole time?
I moved there in 1996, and I've lived within the city ever since. San Francisco is a topic unto itself.
Yeah.
Probably an entire 10 podcasts on that one.
We'll do that next time. How's
yeah,
that?
exactly. Let's avoid that one for now. Actually, I'm a big advocate for San Francisco. It has its ups and downs, but yes, I've been there 30 years now.
Wow,
almost.
that's amazing. And then, so just talk about like your career, how you got into technology and kind of this trajectory of that.
So one benefit of Teach for America was that they kind of facilitate your transition into something else. And that brought me, as I mentioned, to Anderson Consulting, which is, of course, now Accenture. And then left there because I don't like the idea of the union system, where you start as an analyst, you do your years, you go to a consultant, you do your years. Like I'm the most capitalist person you'll ever going to meet. And for me, I often refer to this as jungle animals versus zoo animals.
Yeah.
I'd rather die in the jungle hunting my own than be fed.
I like that. That's cool.
And so I left and went to a startup that didn't make it. But as I said before, kind of rose to a leadership position there, probably before my time, took half of that company to another one, merged it in, and we eventually sold that company. That was my first 2 experiences in what it was like to run a startup, which I will tell you is a jungle affair. But those lessons have been with me ever since.
Yeah. Well, I want to learn about lessons that you've learned because you took over at Sigma as the CEO in the throes of the pandemic in May of 2020, which is pretty interesting. Let's drill down on Sigma a little bit because, I think I saw this on maybe your website or maybe on some social. You said Sigma Computing is not another BI tool, which I thought was really interesting. So BI, business intelligence. And so why did you lead with that? I think it's in your bio of the company on Twitter or something like that.
Yeah, and mostly because I don't think the world needed another BI tool. So you certainly don't want to solve yesterday's problem. I often tell folks when they look at joining companies, or the way that I think about companies that I believe will be successful, is I actually don't look at the company. I look at whatever's below that company. And in Sigma's case, the thing that was changing was, first, you had these many years of declining storage prices in platforms like AWS. And the law of economics will tell you that the cheaper the price, the more the volume. And that's exactly what was happening. You had huge amounts of data piling up in these cloud platforms. And it kind of went from being a liability. And if you were in the infrastructure space, the way that showed up is you had kind of moved data from one layer to another layer until it eventually wound up in like tape that no one could even restore from, to an asset where everyone's like, well, wait a minute. There's something in this data. We could do something better, right? We can make better decisions. We can make faster decisions. But the challenge is it's so big now. Like, how are we going to leverage it? And then we had old terms like big data, which have since gone away. Snowflake, Databricks, Redshift came along and organized that data for us. So you had these 2 amazing technology developments. But it didn't change for the average person. If I was working in marketing or the inventory team, or I was at RBC as a wealth manager, Snowflake and Databricks, frankly, just didn't make a whole lot of difference for me. It was a database shift from premises to cloud, great for an IT person. We wanted to make that layer that had changed dramatically make a dramatic impact for that wealth manager. We wanted them to have access to tens, if not hundreds of billions of records on demand. We didn't want to have them go to an expert to do their jobs.
Yeah.
So we set out to, and frankly, Rob Woolen and Jason Franz, who founded Sigma, set out to build a product for the average person. And keeping in mind, when you do that in Silicon Valley, we've got decades in Silicon Valley of building technical tools for technical people. Very little has been built in the B2B space for average people. And Sigma wants to really change that dynamic. So we're pretty well on our way.
Yeah. So you just mentioned the three founders. What were the conditions?
Two founders, just to be clear.
Yeah. What were the conditions in which you came in at a very difficult time? I mean, when you think, I'm sure you started talking to them, prior to the pandemic and the like. But I'm just curious because obviously, businesses, they evolve, right, over a period of time. Sometimes to scale that business, you need some fresh blood, that sort of thing. So explain a little bit about that transition.
This was I will say a crazy story, but I've come to believe and understand that most startups have crazy stories. We tend to only hear about the ones that start at point A and go up and to the right forever. But the reality is that it's a pretty winding path. Rob and Jason founded Sigma coming out of Sutter Hill Ventures as EIRs in 2014 with the idea that I've already mentioned. And I think the necessary underlying conditions weren't there. Nothing had changed to really demand a different product in the way that we've gone after that market. Of course, over those years, Snowflake in particular really rose to prominence, obviously was the largest software IPO in history. And I think at that time, the convergence of Snowflake in the market and then later Databricks with the idea that we could take this billion-person strong skill set called a spreadsheet and put it on top of this really new and powerful thing called a cloud data warehouse just kind of found its time. So on the downside, the company was 6 years in. It had $800,000 in ARR and 50 employees, and at a time when every other tech company was booming. So it was a tough spot to be in. The flip side was it had absolutely the best idea. So to Rob and Jason's credit, first decision that we made in 2020, and in fact, when I interviewed with Rob, was the day San Francisco shut down in COVID. We were the last three people in the Sigma office before it closed by mandate. The first decision we made was to rewrite the whole product. You imagine like the gut punch of working at a startup for 6 years and starting over. And that's exactly what we did. Now, having said that,
was that your vision? Like obviously there was some realization that those two founders came to, right, to go hire somebody to help them transform the business. And I'm just curious, like how involved were you in that process? Because I think at some point, I'm sure you wanted to put your own imprint on this company for the path forward.
The funny thing is, like, there's very little I's and me's in building a company, and I'll tell you a little story about Sigma to give you understanding, like how much resilience companies need to build up. The reason that they looked for a CEO was that Rob had been the CEO, and they had come up with what I would consider to be a version 1.0 product in 2019. And they hired a sales leader, a sales and marketing leader, to start to take that to market. And one of the things that we say when you're building a company is that every salesperson you hire is actually a product manager. They're not a salesperson. The last thing you want from them is actual sales. What you want is to learn as fast as you can about the interaction between you and the customer, right? The 3 whys. Why do they need something? Why would they choose your product? And why do they need it now? And you want to learn as fast as you can to get to product market fit. The person they hired to do that tragically died 6 months later on the job.
Oh, wow.
And had a terminal illness, didn't disclose it. And you can imagine you're already struggling as a company, and now you're struggling through this. And I think Rob at the time had decided, what he really loved doing, even to this day, is building great product. Wasn't necessarily doing the CEO job. And had the humility, I think, to say, like, look, I'm just going to get someone else to do this because I know where I'm going to add the most value. I came in some number of months after that. So that was in November. I started in April or early May. That was the actual decision-making
and
process.
All remote. So like how long did it take to get to know your employees other than on Zoom?
Great question. I have 2 answers to that question. One is I started a practice that I continue to this day. In fact, the last things I did before coming here. I meet every single person that joins the company in a one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
I do. It used to be 30 minutes, but now it's a 15
How many employees
minute.
do you have?
We have 500 today.
And just burst across where? Just primarily in the U.S.?
We have a couple hundred in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple hundred in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And then we, of course, we're a enterprise sales model. So we have folks regionally spread out as well. And then we have maybe 20 in London now.
Okay, cool.
But back to the story was, when I got to know those people through those one-on-ones, but I would consider us to be the first company that mandated its employees come back to the office, which was for quite a while, as you'd imagine, kind of a struggle for hiring.
Yeah.
But at the same time, was absolutely the right thing for speed.
Which, by the way, I mean, there was such, between New York and San Francisco primarily, there was a totally different view on that, and I think a lot of businesses, and I've said this again and again, mentorship is really important. And I just feel like, I'm sure like we've heard it about education, we've heard it about the kids, what that meant for them in school, but professionally, man, like there had to be so many of these folks who like wanted to stay home, who are set back now in their careers, probably years, if not, like they're going to end up going to find something else to do. Was that kind of part of the realization for you? Yeah. And chemistry and all those sorts of things, like how do you create a culture on Zoom?
You can't.
Yeah.
I know people try to defend this, but to use your words, I use these words all the time. You're either a mentor or a mentee. Mm-hmm. There is no one in between. Mm-hmm. So if you allow a really professional, standalone, independent person, meaning that is fully capable of doing a job, to work remotely, you gave up on the mentorship part. Mm-hmm. If you allow a person that hasn't figured out how to do the job, you've given up on the mentorship part. Maybe more importantly than that is that every day I walk into Sigma, it's a very different company. Mm-hmm. And the time to learn is the thing that we most value. So trying to disseminate those lessons across, I don't know, at that 500 offices as homes, as opposed to like the 2, I honestly believe it has put us in the leadership position we're in today because we learn faster than everybody else. Mm-hmm. And if that comes at the expense of commute, so be it. Having said that,
people should listen to podcasts on their commute. You know what I mean? Like, come on.
Exactly. There's plenty of ways
like
to make it productive.
This podcast, by the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the most popular decision, honestly. At the same time, philosophically, it's very simple. People who invest in small companies, whether it's with their time mm-hmm. or with their money, take huge amounts of risk. My job and our job as leaders is to reduce that risk as much as we possibly can and isolate it to the thing we have to take risk on. And in the history of the world, I had not seen a good model of let's work all from our houses. So we were going to take that risk off the table. Yeah. I think it's paid off.
Yeah. And just as an aside, because as 2 former lax bros, do you remember that movie Scrooge from the late 80s? There's a scene where, and this is going to the I's and me's, there was a scene where this guy said, as my lacrosse coach said, there's no I in the word team. Like, I thought that was really funny. As an aside, that's one of my favorite movies from the 80s. At what point did you realize, once you kind of reoriented the business, obviously it was still a very tough time and into 21, that sort of thing, where you were like, I'm going to put my imprint on this business going forward? Because I have to assume, like, founder-led companies, they don't get too much pushback, right? And you come in, you take over, and you're given a mandate for all intents and purposes. So at what point did you say, okay, I'm going to do things a little differently that had been done, over the last, let's say, 5-10 years?
Oh, I remember distinctly when I started, I asked Rob, how do you want to do this transition? And Rob said to me, he's like, you're the CEO, just go do it. Mm-hmm. So first credit has to go to Rob and Jason, because the humility there was, we hired you to do the job, go do the job. I'm not going to stand in your way. I'm not going to make it harder. In fact, I'm going to dump it on you and tell you, like, go make it happen. So I had a ton of support from Rob and Jason. I had a ton of support from our board and still do. Those things are fundamental if you're going to be successful. The second thing was really culture. One of the things that I've realized about early stage companies are largely led by their product and engineering teams, because your first job is build a great product. And engineers are not competitive. Salespeople are competitive because they win or lose. There is no middle ground. So the first thing I wanted to imprint on the company was, let's take all of the things that are great about this culture, which were a high velocity mentality around doing things, helpfulness, and add winning. And so we spent time actually writing down what we call operating principles, which are not values, because none of us really believe that anyone that have values on the wall, do anything about those values. Our operating principles are very measurable. We know what behaviors we're looking for. And one of them was like winning matters. And we measure winning. We measure winning on a sales basis, on a performance for product basis. So I really wanted to imprint the idea that winning matters on the company early on, so that we could demonstrate progress.
Yeah.
And I think, again, everyone contributes something. That's probably the one that I would say I was most passionate about.
So just do me a favor and explain in your own words what the primary product and service is, and then, what are other kind of bolt-ons to that? And then I want to kind of get into, your customers and competitors.
So I come back to, again, the idea that when things change below you, you have an opportunity to have a customer think differently. And when customers adopted platforms like Snowflake and Databricks, they suddenly had, via the internet, a mechanism to give a lot of people access to data that they could not do before. Keep in mind, they were coming from environments where you had storage silo A, storage silo B, application A, application B. You had to have some sort of proxy for the people consuming the data to get access to it. That changed. And so what we do is take advantage of what cloud platforms delivered and then cloud data warehouses delivered, so that we've built an interface, in effect a UI, for various types of skill sets to directly access that data. What that means is, if you know how to run a spreadsheet, you can take those spreadsheet skills and for the first time apply them on 50 billion records. We show our product to people and they look like, that pivot table has 50 billion rows in it. That's amazing. No one's ever done that. If you try to do that in a Google Sheet or in Microsoft Excel, you have a 1,000,000 row limitation. But for most people today, there's no magic in 1,000,000 rows. You have to aggregate data to the point it has no meaning. So if you're working in that wealth management team, or if you're working as a trader, you want the most granular data that's the most accurate, the most live, so that it's almost like an arbitrage play, so that you uniquely found something that's going to give you that little advantage. And that you can do that on demand, so you don't wait, right? So I have the best data in the fastest possible time with my skill set, no intermediary, I'm going to win. So what Sigma does is give that spreadsheet interface. You can write Python, you can write SQL, you can do collaboration with your peers. You can not only do all the legacy BI stuff that I hate talking about, I love talking about the spreadsheet stuff, which is like forecasting and reconciliation of data. You can also build applications. Mm-hmm. So I often say we do all the things BI does, and no one needs to everyone knows that definition.
Yeah.
But no one should be paid for looking at a dashboard. People get paid for automation. You can look at historical data, you can forecast it, you can reconcile it, and then you can build on those conditions, automations that make your business move faster and more accurately. That is Sigma.
Yeah. And you mentioned financial services. Is that a primary end market right now?
100%.
Yeah.
Well, first of all financial services businesses are data arbitrage businesses. Yeah. So if you can walk in and say, I can give you a far more secure and governed way of giving more people access to better data faster, this is basically the definition of what you want in financial services, which is why you see companies like JP Morgan using Sigma, DTCC, Blackstone, Northern Trust, I can keep going. They understand that the more they're able to extend that access, the better they will be as companies. We have a unique side value, which is the fact that in this architecture, we never move data out of that warehouse. So uniquely, we're this rare case where we are providing better access with less risk. So we don't cache anything. We don't extract it. So if you have these cybersecurity products, you have lineage, you have governance, all of that you've built in your warehouse is 100% consistent with Sigma on the top of it. So faster and more secure is a rare message in IT, and that's something we are able to deliver.
Yeah, and so give me a sense of, let's say, partners versus competitors.
So if a partner, clearly for us, coming back to this idea of the layered stack, is going to be the database provider. They are enabling huge amounts of data to be accessed on demand, but they, as we all know, famously get paid on a utility basis. Mm-hmm. So no one if you're an investor in Snowflake or Databricks, what you care about is consumption. We enable that consumption because we are bringing more people to the platform. We're allowing them to do more things on that platform. I often metaphorically talk about communication. If you think way back into the 20s and you wanted to communicate between businesses and type a letter, you had to go to somebody with a skill set called typing, and you would dictate something, and they would maybe pump out X number of letters a day. Mm-hmm. And over time, as we've lowered the bar for communication, we learned to type ourselves, and then we eventually had a phone, and then we had text messages and Slack. Nothing got replaced. We added. So the lower the barrier, the more you get. And the same phenomenon happens in Sigma. We have extended the ability for more people to do things far more easily, therefore they do more of it. The consequence for a Databricks and a Snowflake means that's more consumption. So we are a partner because we are synergistic in taking this data asset, making it more and more relevant to businesses. They obviously monetize that, as do we. Businesses get better value, they're faster, they're better. Customers are obviously the ones that are sitting on the other end of that. If I'm a wealth manager, I'm working compliance at a large bank, but I could be in the supply chain or inventory team for a retailer. Those are all people. Every job is a data-driven job. The problem has always been the distance between that user and the data itself.
So let's talk about this, because and based on our conversation from a few weeks back, it sounds like you have a really great knowledge and understanding of what works in the public markets. And you just raised capital in May at a $1.5 billion valuation. You raised a couple $100 million, and I think in the press release it says up 60% from the prior raise, which is kind of interesting. And we talked about this at that dinner. There's a lot of folks who don't want to raise capital right now. They don't want to consider, an IPO because they don't want to do a down round for all intents and purposes, right? And so when I think about this, like what's worked in the public markets right now, it was very narrow, right? It was the hyperscalers. It was, NVIDIA, who are providing the chips that go into the servers, that go into the data centers. And then there was memory and, all that sort of stuff. And now it seems to be broadening out a little bit. And you had a lot of interesting comments about enterprise software in general. So I want to just take one step back here because, this platform, your company, prior to you getting there, was built on machine learning capabilities, right? And so then we get to the end of 2022 and ChatGPT, 3.5 comes out, and it seems like, less, as it relates to consumers, despite the fact the first use case really was a consumer, kind of interface. But it just took the whole tech world by storm. And not just in the public markets. You just mentioned a Databricks. It has a $55 billion valuation, right? Snowflake, which you mentioned in the public markets, has a $60 billion valuation. But, and you just mentioned it was the largest software IPO ever, and I think it came in late 2020 or early 2021. At one point, this stock was up like 200% because it was like, it was the flavor of the month sort of thing. Well, it's down 55%. It's still down on the year, and Databricks is now, raising at much higher valuations. So let's talk about how the narrative around generative AI with enterprise, software companies, because there's a lot of stuff going on. Like the other day, I don't know if you saw Mark Benioff. He was on CNBC. They had just reported earnings. The stock was at a new all-time high. It was up 10%. He's on with Jim Cramer, and one of the first comments that comes out of his commentary was taking a shot at Microsoft. It was taking a shot at Copilot, and he's like, go talk to people within Microsoft, who work there. They're not even using Copilots, all right? So let's talk about what this generative AI narrative has meant for you, because it's changed an awful lot. But I keep saying this is already part of the fabric of a lot of companies like yours. It's just moving forward now at a different sort of narrative. Does that make sense?
Oh, I agree that it is another layer.
Yeah.
Right? We talked about cloud data warehouse layer. It's another layer. I tell everybody that there are two benefits from getting older. One of them is your network is bigger, and the second is that you have more pattern matching skills. And one of the frameworks that I think of from that pattern is tech changes first, products change second, and people change third. Mm-hmm. And I think that we are still early in the product part of that for AI. Obviously, the technology changed.
You mean like use cases, basically?
Yeah. You can change the fundamental capability of a technology, as we saw where we married old ideas of AI with new things in GPUs. But products that take advantage of that are really just starting to be built now. Kind of the race is on. There's a lot of money flowing into AI. But to be frank, a lot of that is going to get wasted.
Right.
That's just the way it works.
That was the commentary. A lot of folks don't want to admit that right now. If you think of the hundreds of billions of dollars that are being invested to build out data centers, but a whole host of other products and services that are going to benefit from the speed of the compute, that sort of thing. And so they don't want to hear it. And they keep hearing this, that they'd really rather ask for forgiveness than permission. But the rate of CapEx, quarter over quarter or, even year over year is declining, right? And at some point, if there's less demand for this compute, to your point, because a lot of these private companies, just fall by the wayside. And we're already starting to see that. You're starting to see cuts, you're starting to see valuation, come down a little bit. Then you're going to have a build out of overcapacity. And we've seen this in almost every tech cycle. So speak to that a little bit, because you had a lot of commentary at that dinner again about enterprise software and how there's risk to some of these models in the SaaS space that were thought to be, the next stage of this, but yet they were massively underperforming for the better part of this year in public markets until you saw a dash for trash in some sort of way, until you said, okay, we can only bid up Facebook so much based on their, the investments they made in Meta AI, and it goes across all the hyperscalers. Microsoft was massively underperforming until very recently. So talk about that a little bit.
I feel like that there are two things going on here. Obviously, you rightfully speak about like the amount of capital flowing into AI, and the industry is built in a way as to throw a bunch of dollars out there, and almost I refer to it as Highlander, right? We start to see like who kills who, to the point where there's like a few big companies that remain. And obviously the goal for a lot of these investors is, win that Highlander race and hope that the gains at the top of the pyramid outweigh the losses at the bottom of the pyramid. And I think we're very early in that cycle. One of the things that I look at with a little bit of skepticism is what companies are building true products, which ones are building really just easy to replicate extensions off of publicly available LLMs. If your use case is a prompt engineered LLM for a department, you're not going to make it. It's going to be too easy to rebuild that. And even if you get to a certain scale, someone is going to do even an 80% good job as you do, and then it's going to be price pressure. So I have some skepticism about some of the products, if you will, being built there. I have a lot of skepticism about the rate at which companies are going to be able to adopt these things. If you work, as we said earlier, in the financial services space, you've got a regulator. AI makes a bunch of assumptions that regulators have no idea how to think about.
By the way, I've been saying this on Fast Money, and I get so much pushback and regulatory. You're not think about hallucinations. Think about if you're not clicking through to the citations. I sit on the desk at Fast Money, and I'll hear some guest say something, and I'll go to Perplexity, and I'll figure. But before I say it on national TV and try to take I'm not trying to take anybody down, but to have an opposing viewpoint, I better look at that citation. You know what I mean? So then you say to yourself, how much time is it actually saving me right now? Is that a decent thought process?
I think it's a reasonable one. You mentioned Copilot earlier, and we have a lot of developers. I kind of look at Copilot as a single-digit hours per week savings for our developers. That's just not that great.
Right.
And Copilot's not new, right? It's been around for some time. And it's not to say that if we look far enough into the future, there won't be breakthroughs along the way that materially change that dynamic. But to think that we're going to wake up 6 months from now and we're going to reduce our development team by 50% is a pipe dream in my mind. And I think anyone that comes out to say these things is trying to position themselves in a space as opposed to talk the reality.
You're one of very few people that I've heard kind of put your neck out there and say these sorts of things. I mean, it's just there's a lot of folks drinking the Kool-Aid. And so I also think about, these LLMs, I mean, the big ones, right? They're getting commoditized here, and you have an OpenAI, which is desperately trying to create, web search and browser and, all these sorts of things, because how do you justify 150 billion, valuation? How does Anthropic, which has one product right now, justify a 20, 30 billion, whatever it was, at last thing? Because, there's no difference in my mind between Claude and, ChatGPT. And I use Perplexity because I can choose, Sonar. I can choose any of them. And to me, they're no different, really.
Mistral, Gemini, Llama.
Yeah.
And you're right, they tend to converge over time. And then someone breaks through and they converge over time, which is great for the rest of us that use them as a utility. Mm-hmm. And
are you using them as just an individual a lot, rather than going to Google and just
as a person, as an individual person?
Individual,
not really, to be honest with you.
So you're still Googling things. But Gemini is giving you that contextual answer now, right? And so, that's my point, and we can move on from this in a second. But if you pay Perplexity $20 a month because you want Pro and you have access to those 4 different models and the one that they're developing, why would anybody pay $20 a month to just ChatGPT or Claude? Like, isn't that logical? I don't get that. Or illogical, I guess.
And we have 2 dynamics here. We have a consumer dynamic and an enterprise dynamic, and I think in the enterprise space. And I'm not a consumer guy, and I don't comment on it because I don't know anything about it. But on the enterprise side, purchasing behavior is not going to change with enterprise. And I agree with your point. You have to have differentiation. If you don't have pricing power. I do think Anthropic is differentiating itself from OpenAI in terms of deployment model. They're really trying to focus on working more individually with an enterprise. OpenAI views itself more as like the way that AWS did many years ago. Here's my platform, take it or leave it. So we see some refinement, if you will, in the market. But in that conversation, the other topic that I think is maybe a little bit more controversial, or maybe one that is starting to pick up a little bit, comes back again to the layers. So you have AI as a value add proposition, but a lot of these companies that are trying to tack on AI to what they do are fundamentally at risk already. And in particular, my target here is what I'll just refer to as departmental SaaS applications. When we think about the fungibility that we created when we went to AWS, I tell people, if you grew up in the time that we did and you went to a large enterprise data center, you could they had brand names like the hardware products in the data center. You knew who they were. That's a NetApp thing. That's an EMC thing. That's a Dell thing. No one asks AWS, which server am I going to be on? They just get a price performance guarantee. They move on. Databases have consolidated data now into these massive warehouses. So we've created a huge amount of fungibility for data. But we took the same siloed applications and stuck them on top, and we called them SaaS. And now you have companies saddled with 50 to 100 not integrated, hard to manage, not customizable, expensive applications. They're next. I really believe that we're going to start to see an environment where you have more of that platform play, where you start to see these departmental applications consolidated onto common platforms and eroding, if you will, that sort of portfolio until we get down to some of what are now called these system of record applications, the ones that are operating at real scale. But I think they become at risk because the way that they maintain their position is because of integrations. And the more that the companies that integrate with them go away, the more they become isolated. That, I think, is the change that is in the offing for large enterprises now. And I really strongly believe 5 years from now, you're going to look at an environment of a far more simplified, consolidated application stack than we see today.
Which is probably going to be one of the biggest disruptions since, in tech, in B2B and SaaS, since what we just learned over the last 2.5 years about how disruptive generative AI is likely to be. But I think what I'm taking away from you is that we're likely to see that, in a longer time period than a lot of folks, who are valuing these things in the public and private markets right now. Let's finish off with this because, again, you had a lot to say about this as far as exits and the anticipation of exits. So obviously, and this was after the election that we met, people are pretty excited about deregulation. We haven't seen a lot of M&A or strategic M&A in tech. There was a bit of, private equity-led M&A, I want to say going back 2.5 years or so, especially in the software space. But when you think about a NASDAQ that is up, almost 28% on the year after having similar sort of gains last year, I've been surprised that folks weren't dusting off those S1s and weren't, you could have actually made a bid for another company, this past summer or something like that, and just waited to see what the new administration, if there was going to be a new administration, whether they were going to be, more open to this sort of stuff. And I get a sense right now, at least, a lot of folks who are like all gung-ho about what Microsoft and Apple and Google and Amazon and Meta might be able to do in the M&A, it seems like, whoever's in charge of the FTC might not be that much more open to what we've had. Some of these cases that are brought against all those names that I just mentioned by the FTC and the DOJ, they don't seem like they're going away anytime soon. VP-elect, J.D. Vance was actually, kind of on Lena Khan's side on some of this stuff. So to me, if you can't bring an IPO in this market, forget M&A, when the hell else are you going to be able to do it? So let's talk about that a little bit, because Jesse had a lot to say, and he's done some great writing on this about what the common, thought process is about a company, what they need to do, whether it be on a recurring revenue standpoint to get to, or profitability to IPO, or size of the kind of market cap. So you had some great things to say about it. Let's repeat it for the audience here.
I mean, in the context of what we were talking about, we're up 80% on a top line basis year over year. We'll do that again next year. So it started with people saying it's a tough environment. It's not a tough environment. Yeah. It's just not. We just saw a jobs report yesterday, up again. We have a very strong economy. It is not a tough environment. The question is whether you have a great product or you're in the right market. So number one was, this is actually a great market to grow a company. It's a great market, number one. Two, really comes down to the idea of, on the one hand, this forward-looking technology on the AI side, and yes, there are tons of dollars flowing into that space. There's a lot of opportunity. The challenge with investment is always timing, right? In some cases, is AI going to be a big part of the future? Yes. When? Don't know. How? Don't know. So there's a lot of money flowing into those bets for sure.
Do you think that's like a bubble right now? Or like some of the valuations in the private market seem bubblish. We've seen massive, multiple expansion. The last time Microsoft traded at 35 times, you know what I mean? That was like the top, or at least for some period. And so what makes me a little nervous, not what's going on in the private markets, not a lot of transparency. We know how those valuations can skip up, but it feels like a lot of those things that you just mentioned are being pulled forward, at least in the valuations in the public markets.
The funny thing is, I have the opposite view.
Oh, really?
I am far more worried about the private market valuations. Okay. I feel like, in watching some of the deals that I've seen go down, and one of the things about building a company is that you really need to manage it up into the right steadily over time. And I think people fool themselves that if they get an outsized valuation, that it has proven anything. But when you get an outsized valuation on a B or a C or a D round, who wins? The employees don't win because they didn't monetize that. Your investors don't win. Backtrack, they've taken a ton of risk. Yeah. You don't win as a CEO, I can tell you that, because that monkey is now on your back. You're going to have to grow into that number. And as you think toward a successful exit of some sort, how are you going to get all those people paid? Keep in mind, right? You take that high valuation, your next employee is now on a fair market value that is going to be really hard to justify. I'm more concerned about the disconnect that's already happening on the private side. You have a, NTM basis, 6 to 10, multiples out there for SaaS companies. There are some that are clearly on the high side, large caps maybe. But I feel like I look at those and think, okay, that at least we understand. But when we start to see 40 or 50 times next 12 months, how are you going to grow into that?
Sales. I just want to be really clear. Yeah.
Not even revenue.
I know.
So that's that's going to be tough, And
but both things can be true, by the way. And if we learned anything from 21 into 22 was that the public markets led the private markets, right? And as far as so and Snowflake is the best example of that. That was north of $100 billion market cap in the months after its IPO, and it was trading at like 80 times sales. Well, if you look at OpenAI, it's doing about the same thing. How do you grow into that, that multiple, and how do you get to the public markets? And you know what I mean? So that's what's crazy. What's different now is that you just mentioned, a D round, okay, where very few are able to monetize that. Well, what I worry about when things get to the public markets is that you have these growth funds that are already participating. So then you ask yourself, who is the incremental buyer in, the public market? Yeah, Fidelity and Capri and, all those guys, Wellington, they're going to put orders in, but they've been participating, that sort of thing. So that's what's different, I think, if you go back, let's say 10 years or 20 years. Does that make some sense?
There's no doubt that what were not even crossover funds years ago have participated for years now on the earlier and earlier side, not in some cases even C rounds.
Well, that's really important. All right, so these multi-strat funds that were never participating in privates, they're looking to add alpha because a lot of them have actually been underperforming the market, and you're paying 2 and 20 for that sort of underperformance. So how do they get alpha? You get involved in something that is generally illiquid, that you don't have to take marks the way you do on a quarterly basis, right, and report to your investors. They're kind of like side pockets, if you will.
They definitely seemed to think they had to diversify back in the day. I do feel like now, we have a lot of debates about, and I hear a lot of debates about, can you go public, or what does it take to go public? And a lot of folks opine on this. We have an amazing board member in Brad Gerstner from Altimeter, talks a lot about this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that, I think he would make the case, and I hate speaking on his behalf. I don't think that the core fundamentals have changed. If you're selling into a big TAM, if you have a strong top line growth, and you do that on a relatively efficient basis, you can go public. An institutional investor will recognize that, which is why back in the conversation we were having along at the table, when people are sort of blaming the environment, I think the first thing they need to look at is their own business. Yeah. And if they're not able to deliver one of those things, the problem is not in the external environment. So I don't know. I'm not the
So what do you expect for 2025? Let's assume that the economy keeps humming along here. Let's say we get deregulation. Let's say interest rates go down for the right reasons, that sort of thing. Are you expecting just an absolute just kind of stampede towards new issues? And one of the things that's interesting comparing it to 2021 is you're not going to have these shitty SPAC models, right? So these are going to be companies that are meant to go public, and there's going to be demand for them, hopefully, and they're fitting this new narrative.
I don't know that there's a demand in 2025. I think there are a lot of companies, you and I, we were talking about the dot-com era back earlier in the conversation, and $100 million companies, that was considered a public company candidate. I don't think we're at that place anymore. So I think you're looking at $300 to $600 million companies. Like ServiceTitan's a good example right now. But the problem with that is now you're looking at companies that are potentially growing a lot more slowly. So it's a really interesting dynamic.
As they become more mature, because and also and Mark Cuban has said this again and again, and he knows that from experience in the late 90s, is if you don't get to market where you still have that kind of really good growth that makes it attractive for investors to pay a slightly higher multiple than they would normally do for something that's a bit more mature of a business, you kind of have to hit that stride to some degree.
I think timing, I'm sure, matters at some point. I think 2025, I think the bigger story in 2025 and 2026 is going to be the number of zombie companies that have to come out into the daylight. Yeah, I think there are a lot of them that are going to run out of capital. They don't really have an incentive to wind things down in the way that they probably should at this point, and they're all sitting on valuations that, in some cases are probably 10x what they're worth. When I go to the conferences that I go to, the real lunch table conversation is how do we wind these things down? And to your point earlier, and it's not to say that they're going to rise to the FTC level, but the M&A environment has been basically dead. Yeah. So the one question will be, does anyone kind of wade in to consolidate these companies, either at a PE level, or do VCs do it? Do they just simply go away? I don't think that we've seen even the tip of the iceberg on the companies that are not going to make it. And now that we have funds that are heavily invested in the next wave, I wonder if we're going to see an increased motivation to kind of wrap up, if you will, the underperformers of the last wave.
Yeah. Well, listen, you and I have a lot to catch up on in 2025, because it'll be interesting to see, how these valuations work out, what gets wrapped up, what gets stuffed together. Listen, my sense is there's a lot of VCs out there who would love to kind of jam a bunch of their portfolio companies together and cut some costs and do that sort of thing. So it'll be really interesting to watch. It'll also be interesting to see as we get into the new year, what sort of M&A, what gets filed to the IPO market. I'm probably pretty optimistic about that, because a lot of these VCs, they need exits, right? They need to recycle a lot of this capital. So, okay, Mike Palmer, we covered a lot of ground. I'm really glad we got to do this, because I feel like we met at that table. I got to hear a lot of great stuff out of you, and so hopefully you'll come back and we'll do this again.
I would love to. I enjoyed every minute of it, and especially to meet an old lax competitor.
Oh my God. We got to go back and look at the 1991 Central New York record there. I think we closed in the ranks higher than you guys. Because I think we got to the sectional finals and we got destroyed by West Tennessee, which you probably probably remember.
They always were
they
were the number one.
Yeah. So, well, one thing before we get out of here is like, Central New York used to be a powerhouse in lacrosse, and they're kind of done right now. They don't send a lot of kids to Division I anymore. It's really weird. Don't you
I
think?
moved out to California, as we said earlier, 30 years ago, not quite 30 years ago. The number of lacrosse teams and programs, I mean, my lacrosse stick looked like, something an alien would have brought to California. And now it's not just even just men's lacrosse, like women's lacrosse is like, and it's just crazy.
I love
the
the women's
explosion.
game, by the way. I think it's great.
I'll admit to being confused quite a bit.
Well, there's just a few weird rules like shooting space and that sort of thing. Yeah, but it's a great game, and it's obviously a bit less violent and the like here. So if you watch the PLL, the Premier Lacrosse League, which I love, and I'm friends with the founder and the like,
that's great.
I think there's almost like gratuitous violence in that. You know what I mean?
There's a little bit of a UFC in lacrosse, and it's all the way to its origins.
Yeah.
I will say I think there's a difference between West Coast and East Coast, where East Coast is a little bit more physical, especially in the women's. I have two daughters, by the way, that play. So like on the women's
Are they
side.
playing or no?
My older one played in high school. My other one, I think, is starting in the spring. And I just feel like in the West Coast, watching women's lacrosse feels a little bit like a game played by referees.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. My dad, who loves lacrosse, he played in college in the early 60s, and he's the one who got my brother and me into it. He loves the women's game. Syracuse, he still lives up there. They've been fantastic for years. But he gets frustrated by the same things that you get frustrated by. So that's a great way to put it. And we'll leave it there. You and I are going to go get those records from 1991, and we'll see. And when we come back, we'll revisit it. So, Mike Palmer, I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Dan. It was a pleasure being here.